Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How important are the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, especially the ones to promote universal primary school education and to empower women? What are various organizations such as the United Nations Children's Fund and others doing to help achieve these goals? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the important role of education and also the equally important role to empower women to help achieve many of the humanitarian goals that most of us aspire to do. My guest today is someone who's been very involved in these issues. My guest today is Ms. Carol Bellamy. Formerly, Ms. Carol Bellamy was the director of the United States Peace Corps. She was also the former executive director of the United Nations Children's Fund, commonly called UNICEF. And until recently, she was the board chair of the Global Partnership for Education. Just even more recently, she became the chair of ECPAT, End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. Carol Bellamy, welcome to Global Connections.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. You got a tremendous resume here. We could spend the whole 26 minutes on just one, but let's talk a little bit about this recent, you were with the Global Partnership for Education. What exactly is the Global Partnership for Education? When was it formed? Why was it formed? What does it do?
Well, it's been around about a decade. It began under a different title called the Fast Track Initiative. The idea was to accelerate efforts to achieve the Millennium Development Goal focused on education, which was getting all children into primary school. It is what its name says now. That's why we changed its name. It is a very broad partnership of all the actors globally who work in education. Donor countries, developing countries, 60 developing countries are part of the partnership now. Civil society from the north and the south. UN is represented through UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Bank. Teachers are there, of course, because it's education, and the private sector and private foundations. And it's focused on supporting the education plans of countries, their own education plans, support them with policy dialogue, capacity building, and money.
Now, is this organization, Global Partnership for Education, do you come into a country or do you invite a country to participate? Is it a groundswell roots up from the bottom, or is it imposed from the top?
Well, no, it's not imposed from the top. That's the really important thing is the ownership resides in the country. So the country comes to the Global Partnership. I'll just take one, for example, Ethiopia. The minister in Ethiopia, Minister of Education, works together with the other, what the partnership does is bring the other players in Ethiopia around the table around education. The minister presents his or her, it happens to be a he right now, but his or her education plan. There's dialogue, they try and improve the plan, and it comes and is reviewed by the partnership, and then the partnership hopefully has helped bring this input, and it also provides money. In the decade plus that the partnership has been around, we've provided over $4 billion in support of local education plans of the countries. It's not flown in from the UN or flown in from Washington or London. It's their education plan.
Mm-hmm. As you look back on your involvement with this group, the Global Partnership for Education, what do you see as some of the major accomplishments of the organization, and what are some of the major obstacles that they're confronting today?
Well, in global partnership countries, the number of out-of-school children has decreased much faster than in non-global partnership countries, and the number of girls in school has increased much faster than in non-global partnership countries. So those are some of the successes. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't challenges. Challenges are, for example, the partnership wasn't involved in many conflict countries until very recently, so it was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that where the majority of kids are out of school, which are now in conflict countries, the partnership wasn't, but now it is, so it's now taking that on. Two, it has focused very much on access, but one of the big challenges now is, are kids learning anything? And so there really is now an approach of bringing together access along with learning. Just getting kids in school but nothing happening doesn't do very much for them. And then third, while the number of girls and boys has become more or less even in primary school, going into secondary school, there's still a big gap in terms of girls. So keeping girls in school remains a big challenge.
And if our viewers would like more information on this, they can go to www.globalpartnership.org and get a lot more information about what we're talking about and some of the items we may not get to today. When you mentioned conflict countries, the one that, there are several out there obviously, but the one that comes to mind right now is the tragic situation that's unfolding in Syria. We see that this civil war has been underway for, I guess, at least over 2 years. There are like 2 million refugees that the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, other groups are working with. But you also have like 600,000 children who are not able to go to school. How will they ever recover this time lost? They've already lost 2 years plus. Are we losing a generation of leaders for Syria because of this, because they've lost that building block that is so critical to their future and to the future of the country?
Not only are we losing a generation, I fear we're going to lose several generations. I mean, the average length of conflicts in the world today is 12 years, not just even the 2 years of Syria at this point. And the focus in many of these conflict countries has always been keep people alive. So health was always seen as something you do right away and even afterwards when things calm down. But education was never seen as something you do right away. But in fact, it's one of the most important things you can do for a child is get that child into some kind of situation that appears almost normal even though there's an abnormal situation going on. Syria had almost achieved the Millennium Development Goal of having all kids in primary school. That's the tragedy. But now the system is totally broken. Not only are the Syrian children in Syria not getting an education, but there are so many of them now in Lebanon, equal to the number of Lebanese children trying to get an education, that it's blowing up the Lebanese system. It's also having a particularly negative effect in Jordan.
Now, children face many challenges, many problems. One is with the Civil War and the lack of educational opportunities, but you're also working with another group, ECPAT, E-C-P-A-T, that's the acronym for it, and that deals with trafficking and children. Tell us a little bit about what does ECPAT stand for, then we'll get into it. When was it formed and why was it formed?
Actually, this is it's not a single organization. It's a network, a wide network of many organizations, all focused on trying to eliminate child prostitution, child pornography, and child trafficking for sexual exploitation. There was a very major conference in the mid-90s. Queen Sylvia of Sweden actually chaired the conference, and that's really when the effort was kicked off. Very much focused in those days actually in sex tourism, people coming to countries to have sex, frankly. But the focus now has not only included that, but expanded to include sexual exploitation of children. One of the big areas of very worrisome areas these days is the use of the internet in terms of the distribution of the worst kinds of images of children in terms of child pornography. So the effort of ECPAT, and I'm chairing now the international board. There are, as I said, many actors in this network. The effort is around education. It's shining the light. It's trying to change local laws. It's research, but it's bringing people's attention to this. We work with law enforcement agencies as well as social service agencies to try and make sure that the child doesn't become a victim twice.
And if our viewers would like information on ECPAT, they can go to www.ecpat.net.
.net.
Not .net, not .org.
That's right.
Okay. This is so important. We're starting to read more and more, especially in some of the developed countries. We've been reading about horrendous conditions in some of the developing countries for years and years, but it's come as a shock, I think, to some people, not to all, but to some, that many of the problems affecting children, being sold into slavery, working for slave wages, that type of thing, being forced into prostitution, those conditions are existing in developed countries too, in the United States and other countries. Are we making any progress? Are we just finding out more about that? We were only looking at the tip of the iceberg before, that there's more of a problem there that we really need to start focusing on, and it's much more pervasive than we thought it was.
Well, yes, we're making progress. The reality is that more progress has been made for children, whether it's health or education or some of these areas of protection, in the last 2 decades than in many, many years before that. But there's still many challenges that remain. And in fact, this isn't just a developing country issue. Very often, because of economic conditions or conflict or family problems, the ability to exploit children is greater, but very often that exploitation takes the child into developed countries where you have disposable resources. So this isn't something where you just go, oh, that's a terrible thing in poor countries. This is a global problem. And frankly, it's big business in many cases, and it's very big, bad business, which is why law enforcement is involved as well.
Mm-hmm. When you say it's big business, are we talking about it's a huge cartel, people who are making millions and billions of dollars off of this, people who own factories perhaps, people who are running these rings, or are there a wide range of interest in this?
Many different kinds of businesses, but it certainly is, it's organized crime in some cases. It's not only organized crime, it's organized crime. It isn't just the poor auntie somewhere who is so poor she says, okay, I'm going to send my child to the capital because she or he will be able to earn a little bit more money. There's a lot of organization behind this kind of thing. And now again, with the internet and the speed of light and borderless, with the borderless world that we live in today, it even becomes more difficult to try and find. But there are efforts going on. A big ring was just broken up in Canada. The US and the UK are working. The Pope actually just made a very strong statement about trafficking. So there is attention coming from many different places.
You mentioned the internet. Of course, everybody's in favor, or most people are in favor of a free flow of information, that type of thing. But what can be done to try to not control the internet per se, but to monitor it and to put these people out of business? Because years ago they'd go around with a suitcase full of pictures of young kids, but today they get on the internet and it's much more pervasive. They're able to reach large numbers of people. They're not as easily tracked, I would imagine, too. But what can be done in that area?
This isn't just a question of free flow. I mean,
exactly.
Years and years ago, I actually trained
right.
as a lawyer, so I take seriously the First Amendment. But you're talking about the worst kinds of abuse, harm, exploitation, really quite the violation of human rights. In no way could one say this is just a matter of free flow. Frankly, I'm not in law enforcement, so I don't know the specifics of what exactly one can do. But there's a difference between people having the opportunity to learn and be informed and doing terrible things to other human beings, and that should not be allowed.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today we're looking at a wide range of issues, especially ones pertain to education, universal primary school education, as well as empowering women. And my guest today is an expert on these issues. My guest today is Ms. Carol Bellamy. Carol Bellamy has been the director of the United States Peace Corps. She is formerly the executive director of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and most recently, outgoing board chair of the Global Partnership for Education. And as soon as she left that job, she took another one as chair of ICPAT, the End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. Carol Bellamy, these are so important, these issues. And we want the media to cover, we want the United Nations, obviously UN agencies are involved in this, Interpol, the various law enforcement agencies and that type of thing. And we all need to work together on this. Is there something that we could do that we're not doing now that could bring these people together? You mentioned Pope Francis had put this under the spotlight. Is there something else that we could do that maybe would be helpful?
Well, everybody talks nice things about children. Everybody says they love children, and I think they love children, but not enough, frankly, is done in terms of children, and I'm talking across the board. For example, in education, while there has been progress in education, the amount of external development assistance, or foreign aid, if you will, has been going down in support of education around the world. Everybody talks about wanting children to be healthy, and yet there's still very little attention to some things like malnutrition, which can do very terrible things to children. It isn't just a matter of food. People talk about they don't want children to be exploited, but governments around the world spend more money on weapons than they spend on supporting children in their own countries. So we have to translate some of the talk into actual do. And everybody can do something. It doesn't mean I can walk out tomorrow and do something of law enforcement, because I'm not a law enforcement officer, but at least maybe I can explain to somebody else, or I can help teach somebody. Everybody can make a difference.
Exactly. And that is so important. We get everybody involved in this. Now, you were also the head of an agency that has children in its name, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund. When was UNICEF formed, and why was it formed?
UNICEF is a great organization. I love UNICEF. It was actually formed right at the time that the UN was formed, right after World War II. It was the United Nations International Emergency Children's Fund. And it was a fund, and the fund was basically to provide provisions, if you will, like blankets and powdered milk and things like that, to the child victims of World War II. So it was children in Germany and Japan and other countries, Korea and others. But by the early 1950s, that wasn't needed anymore, and there was a debate in the UN General Assembly about whether it should continue. They agreed it should continue, but as a development organization. So it focused now on international development around children's issues. In the early years, very, very much around children's health. Very important. I mean, there were so many, I used to say, if the entire state of Michigan died in 1 year, do you think somebody would notice? Well, at one point, the entire equivalent of the population of Michigan in terms of children under 5 died from totally preventable causes. So it focused on reducing child mortality. In recent years, in addition to health, it's focusing as well on child protection, issues like child soldiers or child trafficking, on children's education, on issues like water sanitation, adequate water and sanitation, on issues like making sure that girls as well as boys get an education. It's focusing on making sure it reaches the hardest to reach.
And if our viewers would like more information on UNICEF, they can go to www.unicef.org, or they can just Google UNICEF.
That's right.
And go right to the website. UNICEF is probably the best known of all the United Nations agencies, I would think. You hear about Trick or Treat for UNICEF. UNICEF has been very involved with Rotary International, with the UN World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, in eliminating polio in the Polio Plus program. But as you were there for 10 years, as I recall, from 1995 to 2005 roughly, what were some of the major accomplishments that UNICEF made during those years, and what were some of the major challenges? Now, I know it's a broad organization. You probably go program by program, but are there some that come to mind that just jump out at you?
Well, one, I think UNICEF strengthened very much its capacity to respond in emergencies, because there were more and more emergencies, conflict emergencies and natural disasters. I mean, the problem is with climate change taking place, and I do believe it is taking place, natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, others, are greater, longer, and very often the most marginalized people live in the most marginalized areas. At the same time, there were conflicts everywhere. Southeast Europe, the Great Lakes area, which is in the middle of Africa, Sri Lanka, Colombia, wars everywhere. And UNICEF needed to be there to try and respond to the needs of children. And not only UNICEF, but certainly we needed to strengthen. So one of the things I feel very good about is I think UNICEF really became much stronger in responding to emergencies. It also strengthened its fundraising, which was very important. It gets a lot of money from donor governments, but it also raises money from the private sector. Some of the challenges, the Convention on the Rights of the Child had just essentially come into effect. It had been ratified by the requisite number of countries, and so beginning to take on some of the protection issues. Everybody always liked that little baby. Nobody can complain. But when you're starting to talk about things like child soldiers and child trafficking and prostitution, everybody gets a little sensitive about this. So I think one of the challenges UNICEF took on, and I think took on pretty well, but it had to take on, was some of the child protection issues.
You mentioned the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was a major, major international agreement. And as I recall, I think every country in the world has adopted it except the United States and Somalia. Is that correct? Or maybe Somalia has signed on, I'm not aware of it. I know the U.S. hasn't.
It is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It is the most widely ratified international treaty in the world. And you are correct. Only 2 countries have not ratified it, the United States and Somalia. The United States has ratified 2 protocols, one dealing with trafficking, but it hasn't ratified the main document. Now, I'd be the first to admit that not every country is treating their children wonderfully, even if they've ratified it. So let's be aware of that. That being said, it has made a difference. It's forced changes in laws. It's forced more attention to some of the issues around children. And really, so much of the language about human rights coming out of the UN is based on American laws. So it really is a shame the U.S. hasn't ratified it.
Mm-hmm. And I remember that when that was adopted back in, or came out of the United Nations system in the late 80s, early 90s, you mentioned that there was a lot of support at the time. Our former President George Herbert Walker Bush was a big proponent, as I recall, of that particular convention. But unfortunately, with so many things, there are people in the United States and elsewhere too who, in some cases, first off, may not like the UN, secondly, may not understand the United Nations, and thirdly, fear something that has the UN imprimatur on it. But really, this is a convention to help children and their parents. It's not going to put the United Nations in charge of the children or take rights away from the parents. That's just a myth that has been out there floating around. How do you dispel that?
Well, first of all, the U.S. has remained quite leery of adopting any international treaties. So that's part of the history of the U.S., which is my personal view, unfortunate. But secondly, there is this, and I would say it's a myth, so I'll use that language too, that if you give children their rights, you're taking away rights from parents. But the convention is very clear. The parents are the critical foundation for children and their rights. And so I used to say to people, okay, even if you don't believe me or trust me, or even if you distrust the UN, all these other countries have ratified it. I mean, show me a country where all of a sudden parents have lost all their rights and children are running around taking over the place. It just isn't going to happen. So the people get these things in their mind. I appreciate differences of views. We should always welcome differences of views. But at least there needs to be some accuracy of those views. And it isn't correct that the convention takes away any parental rights.
We're all entitled to our opinions, our own opinions, but not our own facts. We need to find the facts. Well, let's talk about the last group that we'll get to today, I guess, before time runs out, is the United States Peace Corps. President John F. Kennedy pulled this idea from either former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, or he created it himself, or whatever. But he created the Peace Corps in 1961. You were the director of the Peace Corps for a few years. What was JFK, John F. Kennedy, trying to achieve through the establishment of the Peace Corps and through the 3 goals of the U.S. Peace Corps?
Well, I was actually a Peace Corps volunteer in 1963 to 65. Probably nobody was born who's listening to the show in those days. And then I was the director in the mid-90s. Well, it was the height of the Cold War. I suppose the Cold War went on for a while, and I think that Kennedy was looking, among others, for a way to show how good America was. So if you think about the 3 goals, and we all, those of us who've been Peace Corps volunteers, there are 3 goals. First goal, in no particular order, they're all equal. First goal is that Peace Corps volunteers would go to other countries and they would bring expertise and they would help develop the expertise of people in these other countries. That's been going on. Now that gets defined differently each year because it has to be. There's a lot of expertise in many poor countries right now. Poor doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means you're poor. The second goal was that people in other countries would get to know a little bit more about America, and they would do it through learning and living with and working with that Peace Corps volunteer, just seeing a human being, an American in action, not just having somebody give them some propaganda. But the third goal, very important, is that the U.S. would learn more about other countries. And again, it would do it through engaging with volunteers who return Peace Corps volunteers, who could talk about their personal experiences, the people they work with, the people they taught with, the people they were in agriculture with, the young children in the schools in which they worked. Again, it wasn't having to read a book. Oh, tell me about a country in Africa. It would be somebody, I lived in the Central African Republic. I lived there for 2 years. I worked hard at my job, but the people I lived with worked hard at their job. And it was that third goal, bringing the world home, which was very important.
It certainly is. In the last minute or so we have, as you look back over a very distinguished career, and you have been heading up so many important agencies, how do you feel, are you optimistic about the future? Do you think we're making progress in these different areas and that we're moving forward? There's a lot to be done, I understand, but should we be optimistic?
I was at a meeting last week on education, actually, in Turkey. But it was a meeting of a lot of countries in that region. And I suppose if I hadn't been at a meeting, I'd tell you I was a little pessimistic, because I do get pessimistic when I pick up the newspaper or listen to the news. But there were a group of young people there, again, from a whole range of countries, not just Turkey alone. And when I engaged with young people, they were like in their teens to early 20s. Then I have some hope. All right? I get a little disappointed in leaders in the world, but when I engage with young people, I have some hope and optimism. We need to let young people have a little bit more freedom, not to do anything they want to do, but a little bit more freedom, and we ought to listen to them a little bit more. Things would be a little bit better.
Exactly. There are certain areas we've made great strides in.
Right.
Some we've not moved as fast on. Some will argue climate change is one of them. We
Right.
need to move a little more quickly on that. But these are all important issues, and we certainly need to focus attention on them. And you have certainly done that through your involvement with the UN Children's Fund, with the Global Partnership for Education, with the United States Peace Corps, and with ECPAT, and with many other organizations that I'm sure we haven't had a chance to talk about today. But Carol Bellamy, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.